I think it's the most fun subject in game development by far. So welcome to my talk. I'm happy that there's not that many of you, so we can have a lot more intimate discussion here instead. That's how I like to do it as well. So the way I usually do this is that I welcome everyone to just interrupt me. If you have any questions or if you want me to elaborate on something, just raise your hand and throw it at me and I'll fix it. I'll have a question right away.
The one thing I'll just say if that happens is for the recording purposes.
I need to repeat the question. Got it. I've been instructed. My talk today is about assumption guesstimations and cutting yourself short. It's basically about like what to think about when you scope a game project. Some pitfalls that I suggest you try to avoid, and a bit of tips on how to do that as well. The talk is also divided into two separate sections. The first one is more informative, maybe. The second one is me talking smack about the industry. So that's why I want them to shut the camera off in between. I haven't assessed the scope of this presentation as well, which might be evidence to me not really knowing what I'm talking about. But I've been told that I can push the limits on how long I can talk here. So if you get tired of me, please just leave. There might be a risk that I'll go over the time, but there's nothing afterwards, so you're welcome to stay as well. I think that's it. God damn it. Oh, who am I? Usually, or I'm someone who really likes listening to myself talk about myself. So I usually do a longer introduction of me and my journey in the game development world. But I'm going to cut it a bit shorter today and take that part later on. So this is going to be super irritating. Look like this. Okay. I have about 2 decades of experience in the gaming industry. I started my career in AAA back in 2006. I worked with it for about 3 years. Realized that I don't feel comfortable being like a cog in the machine and just sit for 8 hours a day just clicking. So I turned around a bit, or deep dive into indie. Worked at a company. I can tell you a bit about AAA as well. Back then, 15 years ago, AAA didn't really look like it does today. We didn't have these mega companies and mega studios with thousands of employees. They were more around 100 or 200, but still a bit too big for me. So I deep dived into indie. Went from a company with around 200 people to a company that had 7 people, which meant that, I'm going to talk a bit more about this later, but it meant that you get a bit broader responsibility instead of just zooming in on something. You get to experience the full picture. I worked with that for a couple of years. Realized that it was fun, but I kind of missed focusing on one thing, or having a discipline that was just mine. So I backtracked a bit and went into AA instead. Worked at a company of around 20 people, which is kind of now my natural habitat. This is the middle ground, typically Swedish, where I belong, super lagom. Currently, I'm at a company called Aurora. I don't blame you if you've never heard of us. We're quite new. We've all been around for 3 years, I think. We're not the traditional classic game developing studio. We're an indie development collective, more or less. So Aurora Punks is the shell company or the base, and we invest or buy or help assist smaller companies in different ways. Yeah, I told you. At the company, I have two hats or two chairs. The first one, which is supposed to be my primary, is head of design, where I like oversee the design department. So I facilitate and help organize and mentor all the designers in the different companies and give them feedback. We also have like a small board at Aurora Punks who is the first step in the greenlit process of new projects. So if a studio has like a suggestion or an idea for a new game, they have to present them to us first. And we have to like greenlit them or feedback on them or iterate on them before they are sent higher up. Pretty early at the company, we realized that my expertise was needed on one of the bigger projects at the company. So I got like sidetracked a bit and got the role of creative director for one of the flagship titles that we're developing at Aurora Punks as well. So first I was supposed to be primarily head of design, but now I can say that I work about 20% as head of design, or 10 to 20% depending on the week as head of design, and maybe 140% as creative director. So, scope. I have to be honest with you. I've prepared this talk mentally for like 2 months, or all my life. I don't know. Just this talk for 2 months, and like digitally, I prepared for about 2 weeks. I had a presentation with a lot of numbers and infographics and quite boring stuff. Last night, I went home to my hotel and just, in true game developer fashion, just threw it all away and redid everything. So the presentation is a bit wonky, but I think it's better this way. And what I realized I missed in the other presentation is kind of something to anchor the whole presentation around and something to give examples towards. So what I did when I went home, I asked my two best friends, ChatGPT and Midjourney, to create a company for me. So they come up with Dreamweaver Entertainment. So Dreamweaver Entertainment is a AA company. So it's like mid-size. They like to do games with like a production cycle of 2 or 3 years, something like that. They have a pretty shitty track record. Earlier this year, they released a racing game called Race to the Face. It sold moderately, but it got really crappy Metacritic reviews, unfortunately. The company is about 25 people. They have 6 organizational staff, which is like the CEO, the producer, I don't know, people on the top shelf. 4 coders, 2 character artists, 4 environmental artists, 3 animators, 3 game designers, 2 level designers, and 1 narrative designer, which is, in my opinion, like a pretty standard game development studio. It's perfectly balanced. There is an issue here, though. Can you tell it? They're external. Sorry? Yeah, but they always are. So a new startup and every owner wants to be organization stuff. This is not a company who's made a racing game, right? Because you don't need 3 animators and 2 characters artists, probably, to do a racing game. But for the sake of argument, this is the studio. Suddenly, an opportunity appears. A publisher approaches Dreamweaver and wants them to make a game. The game is based on the award-winning TV series, Action Person Everyone Hates Except the Audience. It's a TV series that's been running for 25 years, so it's long. It's about a lineage of action people who do action stuff. So it's like the grandfather action person, dad action person, and then currently the current generation of action persons. Everyone hates them, and everyone wants to see them dead, except the audience, which is the perfect like premise for a game, right? That's kind of what every action game is, basically, to the core. It's a relatable person that the player kind of relates to and likes for some reason, but everyone in the game wants to see them dead. So it's a perfect game, kind of. Because the current writing strike, the next season has been pushed to 2026. So then they want the next game to be released by then. It has a $10 million budget, which coincidentally means about 25 human salaries for 3 years. This is how the publishers work. So now we kind of set the scene for everything. This is the boundaries for the scope, right? We have the team already, the people who shouldn't be making racing games, even though they have for some reason. Tell them about the person. This is something that I've been thinking a lot about, but I couldn't really fit it in the presentation somewhere. It's kind of related to what I was talking about, that certain teams shouldn't make certain games, right? And I think, at least from my perspective, when I was a student, that's something that I didn't had any knowledge about at all. When I was a student, I thought you come up with an idea and then you just make it, right? You come up with the most brilliant game idea and then you just make it. But in reality, I think you should fit, if you have a team, fit the project to the team you have, right? So if you have 3,000 animators, don't make a racing game. We also have a time frame, right? We have 3 years development cycle. Budget, I put it, god damn it. I put it in bracket because budget is kind of defined by the team and time frame already. There's 2 ways to do it. The right way, the one I'm most comfortable with, the more experienced with, and I think most people do it that way, is that they have a team and they have a time frame and then base the budget around it. There's also an option to like have a budget. We have $10 million and then try to find or figure out the team and how long you can facilitate that team with that budget. But they're kind of the same, even though they're different. Like they work in the same way. A boundary for a scope can also be a source material. We have that in our case with the action person. Source materials can be a book or a TV series or a film or whatever. It's sometimes good to have, but it can also be an obstacle because like not all TV series translate that well to a game, right? It's hard to do an action game about an art movie of 4 cats eating, right? So it depends on the source material. I'm going to go back to this a bit later as well because it's a bit work with the source material. Something that can exist as well is previous installments, right? So you kind of have the boundaries already if you're making a sequel for a game because you can already know what type of game you're doing and what size it is and what kind of mechanics you have and stuff like that. So this presentation is just 3 more slides, so bear with me. And these 3 slides kind of, don't come after each other in chronological order. They kind of mess, I think. So don't see them as a checklist to block off. And they interact with each other. But I can't show that in a presentation, so I have to go through them one by one. Pre-production, I like to use what's called situation marks for pre-production. I'm not a fan of pre-production, or not the way most people handle it. But a pre-production is kind of where you establish the vision. You have the boundaries. So now what do you put inside those boundaries? First off is define main mechanics. I prefer to do this before I set a theme or narrative, usually. Like define what kind of game you're doing. In this example, with the action person game, we want what's called Dreamweaver Entertainment decided that they want melee combat and shooty combat and probably some kind of bullet time, I think, and let's do destructible environment. So I have like the 4 main mechanics already. We define them here, and it's part of the vision. It's like that's the core of the vision. Something here we do as well is establish an art style. An art style is, I'm not an expert on it, but I think there's 2 things to take into account, well, 3 things to take into account. The third one comes a bit later, but do an art style that fits your game. Like, don't do an art style that's targeted towards children, but you're making like an 18 plus game. There's also art style is super good to create shortcuts in development. I'm going to talk a bit more about that later, I think. But define the art style here because it's a fundamental thing with the vision. Define the game length. Game length is, when I talk about game length, I'm talking about like the game from the start to when you finish the final boss. This is a bit different depending on the game. Like simulation games necessarily doesn't have a game length. There's roguelites where the game length is kind of dependent on progression instead. Like you do several rounds of the same round, but I like to think of this as the round. So from start to finish. Yeah, replayability also adds to the game length, but when I talk about game length, I usually just think about the first iteration of the game. In this example, with the art style, we're using like a super realistic, high fidelity AAA art style for some reason. With the game length, I'm thinking 6 hours maybe. This is a bit on the short side. Establish a price point as well, and that's usually dependent on the budget, I say, because price point is dependent on the budget because it's dependent on the amount of game a player expects to get when they buy it. For this example, I usually put them in 3 categories. Like indie games are between $1 and maybe $15, and AA is 15 to 40 maybe, and AAA is 50 to 70. Not right now, I think. Something like that. For this example, we're just cutting it in the middle, so a $30 price point. And this is super important. It's something you should or usually establish quite early as well. Assess scalability and post-production. Like, is this game scalable? Is it a good game to scale after it's released? Like, can you easily do DLC or add-ons or post content? For this game, the way I see it with the vision, I haven't mentioned it, but it's a linear third-person action game. From point A to point B, it doesn't have any replayability whatsoever, which is quite bad for this point, right? But doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but think about it. So like roguelites or strategy games or simulations are much better for scalability and post-production, which is a super important part in game development. Here's the investigate phase of the presentation. Define your target audience. And this kind of circles back to the art style as well. Like who is the game for? And I think this should relate to all aspects of the game. I think I'm going to talk a bit about that later in the second part. But I've experienced game productions that had a very childish art style, which meant that that wasn't the strategy, but that's what happened was that a lot of kids bought it and played it, thought it was a kid game, but it was like kind of hardcore and hard to play. So like people's perception of what the game was didn't really turn out to be what it was in the So define a target audience and have all elements of the game kind of correlates to that as well. Like if you're doing a super violent, bloody game, you shouldn't have childish art style, or maybe have more mature mechanics or mature narrative, for example. Do a team analysis. And I think this is something from my experience as well, something that people kind of forget, but it's super, super important. Assess the strengths and weaknesses. Remember how we talked about the team size and you had 3 animators and stuff like that. The amount of resources you have in a certain discipline isn't the same as the content you get out of it. Some people are super good at some things, or have strength in certain areas, and some people have weaknesses in certain areas. Like if you have 3 animators, but they're all cinematic animators, you don't want a super complicated, like melee fighting styles, for instance. Even though they're animators, they're not the same. This also relates to like seniority and stuff like that. Like 3 juniors aren't the same as 3 seniors, unfortunately. This is super important as well, and something people forget. Everyone who creates games are humans. So gauge motivation. What do people want? What's their interest? Are there a potential stress level that should be taken into account? For instance, maybe people at Dreamweaver really likes making car games and get super unmotivated if they do an action game. Or maybe it's the other way around. Or maybe the level designers are tired of doing car games and want to do an action game, but the coders doesn't, which kind of changes the resources you have available, because it's a human variable. It should be taken into account. Define timeline and key deliverables. This is something everyone should know. I hope you teach them this, all the students. I like to see, or I like to switch the product cycle into like 2 parts. The first one is production. It ends with an alpha. Alpha is defined by feature complete. So don't add any more mechanics after that part. In the middle between the final release, I think I put it down. Alpha is in the middle. Beta is kind of 75% in. Beta is defined by content complete, but not polished and bug-free. And then the last 25% is kind of polishing. It depends a bit about the game, depending on the game and depending on the company. But I think this is a good like rule of thumb. Do a market analysis. Think about, does this game have a place in the market? Not only is there a hole in the market for this game, but is there a need for the game? Is there any competitors releasing games kind of in the same time? Like you wouldn't want to do like an action RPG and release it at the same time as Diablo 4, right? Or a first-person shooter in World War II and release it at the same time as Battlefield or Call of Duty or whatever. So do a market analysis. This is a hard one, I think, because I don't know. Try to figure out a USP for the game. It doesn't have to be super complicated, but something that sets your game apart. It is super important and super hard, and it doesn't have to be like a brand new mechanic. Like it can be a mix of mechanics or a specific element in the narrative. I like Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. I would argue it has a lot of USPs, I think, but one of the USPs are arguably that it's a game about mental health, for example. So it doesn't have to be like a mechanic or a new technology or whatever. It can be a narrative element. The last part is refine the scope. Think about what you've done, or the content you have within the boundaries of the scope, or the scope you have, the vision you have. Take and define pillars from them. And this is, I think pillars are kind of bad word, because people tend to see them as 3 or 5 or whatever it is, equally large pillars. Pillars are elements the game revolves around, or like the most important parts of the game. It can be, for our example, maybe the combat mechanic is what the game revolves around. So that should be the focus. I rather see it as a prioritization rather than pillars, because the list can be kind of long. This also comes to my second point, do a risk assessment. That's why I like to do a prioritization instead of a pillars definement. A trick that I have when I create games is I prioritize things into 3 different categories. I call it the current sprint, the next sprint, and the backlog. The current sprint is what's most important. The second sprint is, and the first sprint is like, this is the mandatory stuff. This is what have to be done. The second part is things that correlates well and kind of, it's not super mandatory, but it's what set the game apart and what create uniqueness in the game. And the third one is like flair. I threw it in the backlog, and as a creative director, my definition of a creative director is the person who says no to all the crazy ideas. So I use the third prioritization for like ideas that I don't want to say no to, but we probably won't make it. So that's like, I wouldn't say the trash bin, but it's kind of like, it's a trash bin where you can pick stuff up afterwards in case you want them back. This is a wonky point as well. Establish a project philosophy or mantra. This is something that I like. It's something that I like to just define it at the start of project so I can point back to it later on. An example could be like, we simplify stuff, or we create bang for the buck, which means like, if we have 2 options to make a complicated thing with less impact or a simple thing with a lot of impact, we pretty much always choose the simple thing with a lot of impact, even though we think the other one is cooler. Arrowhead has a famous saying in their company that a game for everyone is a game for no one, right? Have you heard about it? I don't agree with it, but I like it. It's a project mantra or a company philosophy or whatever it is. I think it's pretty good. For me, I use it as like an excuse almost. So if someone comes up to me with a stupid idea, I can just say, no, we're doing this because it's simpler and it's more bang for the buck, for example. There's something that I can go back and like, it's called lean to. I've already talked about this. Prioritize. I can talk a bit more about it. This, I think, calls for all aspects of game development. It's not just mechanics. It can be, we want to create a cool shader for hit reactions, for example. It's cool, but is it super important? Maybe we can put it in prior to or the trash pile. I don't know. But with every element in the game, try to prioritize them. With the first one being the mandatory stuff. Focus on that first, like the core of the game. Potential pipeline optimization is, like, is there a way where we can use tools or use pipeline elements to make something simpler or faster or optimize our development? For example, if you do like an open world forest game, you might not want an army of level designers placing rocks and stones everywhere, you might want to generate them. If you're doing a city environment, you might use Houdini to do, God, what's it called? Generate environment. This could also be like, if you're mocapping a lot, maybe buy a Rococo suit so you can use that for like early animations or some animations, for example, because they're super, super good. Use photogrammetry if you're a 3D artist, for example. Also, like prototype a lot, like try out proof of concept. And this is not only, I had a discussion with Alexander, who's speaking in the other building right now, about it yesterday. And I agree with him that it's prototypes and like vertical slices and proof of concept is like a bit too undefined, and people use it a bit wonky, I think. For me, here, proof of concept and prototyping is more of do a super simple sketch of a mechanic, do a super simple version of the shader you want to use, or something like that. Like do the first iteration first, and then try it out. If it works, iterate more on it. If it doesn't work, throw it in the trash bin. So, to sum it up, first, assess your boundaries. That is, like, what team do you have? What budget do you have? Do you have anything else outside that kind of affect your project? Put stuff in those boundaries, like establish the core vision of the game. What kind of game are you making? Is it feasible to create this game within the boundaries you have? Investigate market, gauge team and plan, and lately refine the scope. Like, yeah, I think that's it. It was quicker than I thought. Do you have any questions? Håkan?
I really want to touch back a little bit more how you talk about how important it is to have the right team to write the right game concept.
Yep.
So in your experience when you have been in other companies and getting this magic puncture coming to you, how do you assess that? Is this the right team for my company? How hard is it to like maybe release money?
I think that's so the question was like how hard is it to assess if the team you're working with is the right team for a project? It's not generally hard. Like if you work with a team for a couple of years, you kind of know the strengths and weaknesses already. I mean, it's different to talk about it in a talk than actually experience it, but you know the people you're working with, you know what they're doing. You probably know what they want to do as well. So I wouldn't say it's hard. It's something that comes kind of natural. You can feel it, or like you know it. You know if the team you're working with is a team that's really into Souls-like, or want to create a Souls-like, or if they like racing games, or I don't know, animal survivor games. But it's more of an organic process than actually like sitting down and analyzing the team you have. Yeah.
You mentioned, I think, very briefly when you were talking about establishing the art style that there may be ways of sort of selecting one that is easier to produce.
Yeah.
You want to elaborate on that?
So the question is like, how do you select an art style that's easy to produce, or what to think about? I'm not an artist or art director or art lead, so I'm not an expert on it, but I can give you a couple of examples. I'm going to show you a bit later on in the presentation more examples, but it could be doing a more stylized game. If you're doing a more stylized games, there's options to just remove textures and just use colors instead, for example. Like create, if you do like, here's a bad example, but a Mario character doesn't need textures to be recognized as Mario, right? It just needs the colors in the elevator. That's an option. You can get a lot of fidelity with just lighting and like scatter, for instance. You can use, I don't know, marketplace assets, for example, which I think is a good option if you're, especially if you're a student. I worked with this as well as a professional developer, especially when I try things out in Workspace stuff. It's much easier to create an environment with like trees, for example, if you actually have the trees instead of me trying to do trees in Maya. That never works out. It wasn't really related to the art style, but it's a way to simplify stuff. Yeah.
I guess you're using like an agile project management style, so
Yeah.
sprints and so on. So how do you do your guesstimations as a team, for example?
That's a super good question, and it's hard. I always work with contingency plans. So for example, when we plan a sprint, right now we're working in 4-week sprints with a mid-sprint review as well. The reason we do that is we want shorter sprints, but we don't want the overhead of a lot of meetings, basically. So what we do is we only like add tasks to maybe 60 or 70% of the actual sprint. We have a buffer time in the beginning of each sprint, which is like recoup what we didn't make in the first sprint or the previous sprint. We also have, well, this is a lie. I'm gonna try to frame it. We don't have a pre-production phase. Our pre-production phase is the 2 months or 2 weeks before each sprint, where we kind of evaluate where we're at the project, what kind of mechanics we have, how they work together, like how can we push this to the next step. So instead of like writing a 300-page GGG for a couple of months and just wasting a lot of money, we just do it as we go along. And I think that's super agile and a super good way to work as well. That's why I said I mentioned I don't like pre-productions. I think they're a waste of time. Even though I had a phase called pre-production. More questions? Ah. I would say no, because I don't think like having a childish art style for a horror game is a bad art direction, because like there's a lot of childish elements that are like staples in horror games or horror movies, like clowns or dolls or stuff like children in general. But I think it's a bit subjective, and it's an assessment you have to make with every project. Like, does this art style work for the game we're trying to make? If we're making a horror game, can we make it with bears and still be a horror game, for example? And it worked. More questions? Yeah.
So say that the Dreamweaver, they had the 3 or 4, they had melee combat, shooting combat, and the bullet time.
Yeah. And destructible environments. Yeah.
So say that the dreaded thing happens, Alpha is creeping up, and we still haven't proved that bullet time is going to work. We're going to have that. Yes, it's happening. How do you sort of pivot that? Speak a bit about like the whole process you would do into that. We try to push through. We try to focus more on the other.
That's a really good question, and thank you for asking that. It was about the question was, if you have a certain set of mechanics and you realize that you're not going to be able to make all of them unless you're crunching, maybe, Like what's the thought process behind that, and how do you navigate that, if I understand it correctly? I was going to circle back to it, but I forgot about it. So thank you for asking. That's what I meant with prioritization. Like you should prioritize those mechanics from the start, where like the shooty and the melee stuff is the mandatory part. That's prior one. That's something you can't really live without, or you can't make the game without it. The bullet time and the destructive environment is just flair. You add on. It's additional to the game core game experience. So they're kind of lower priority. So if you realize that the shooty and melee stuff isn't up to par when alpha creeps up, you cut on the lower priority, I'd say. I'm not a fan of crunching. I never do it anymore. And I think it's disruptive. Sorry for stealing your question to talk about crunch, but I think it's disruptive for like group project morale and trust in the company and stuff like that. So I think all modern normal companies should try to avoid